Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into the life cycle of a marriage under Philippine law. We're going to take the dense, complex text of the family code and turn it into a clear roadmap for you, covering everything from getting the license all the way to a final court decree. So here's our game plan. We're breaking down Articles 22 through 54. We'll start with the license, then get into what makes a marriage void from the get-go. We'll take a really close look at psychological incapacity, untangle the difference between void and voidable marriages, and then finally, we'll talk about the aftermath, what happens to children and property when it's all over. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1. Think of this as the front door to marriage. Before anyone can say I do, the law has some very specific rules you have to follow.
You might think the answer is obvious, right? But here's the thing. The law actually carves out some really fascinating exceptions for situations that don't quite fit the mold.
Okay, so 9 times out of 10, the answer is the marriage license. This is basically the state's golden ticket. It's the official piece of paper that says, yep, you're both legally cleared to get married. Without it, the law generally says the marriage just isn't valid.
But here's where the law gets practical. It recognizes that life happens. So under Article 27, we have the 5-year cohabitation rule. If you've been living together as husband and wife for at least 5 continuous years, and there's no legal reason you couldn't get married, you can actually skip the license. All you need is a joint affidavit. It's the law's way of acknowledging a relationship that's already well established.
But here's a huge word of caution. You cannot just wing it with these exceptions. The courts are incredibly strict. Just look at the Bonsit-Toralba case. This couple tried to use the 5-year rule, but they couldn't actually prove they'd been living together that long. The Supreme Court came down hard and said, no license, no proof of the exception, no valid marriage. End of story. These are hard and fast rules, not just suggestions.
So that brings us right to our next section. What happens when a marriage is missing one of these essential pieces right from the beginning? We're talking about void marriages, unions that are basically broken before they even start. The key phrase you need to know is void ab initio. It's just Latin for void from the beginning. Now, it is so important to understand that this is not a divorce. A divorce ends a marriage that was valid. A declaration of nullity, on the other hand, is a court officially stating that a legally recognized marriage never even existed in the first place. And if you look at the grounds for a void marriage, you can see they're really serious. We're talking about fundamental flaws, like being married to someone else already, marrying a close relative, or being married by someone with no authority. These go against the very definition of what society considers a marriage. The rules around presumptive death are a perfect example of how strict the courts are. In the Orsolino Villanueva case, a wife's husband disappeared. She wanted to remarry, and she said she'd asked some relatives about him. The court basically said, that's not good enough. To get a declaration of presumptive death, you need a well-founded belief, and that means you have to prove you did a diligent, active, and exhaustive search. Just waiting around isn't going to cut it. And now we get to the big one, Article 36. This is probably the most talked about, most debated, and most litigated reason for nullity in the Philippines, the very complex idea of psychological incapacity. So what does this actually mean? Thanks to landmark cases like Tan Andal, we have a much clearer picture. This is a legal concept, not a medical one. We're not talking about just having a bad temper or not getting along. The court is looking for a deep-seated, durable personality structure that makes a person truly, fundamentally incapable of performing their most basic marital duties. For any law student watching, you need to know this 3-fold test by heart. To succeed, you have to prove all 3 elements. First, gravity. It has to be a genuine inability, not just a difficulty. Second, juridical antecedents. The condition must have existed when the marriage vows were taken. And third, incurability. It has to be permanent. Miss even one of these, and the case fails. So how do you prove all this in court? The courts rely on what's called the totality of evidence. There's no single silver bullet. It's about building a case piece by piece. You'll have expert testimony from psychiatrists, you'll have witnesses, family and friends who saw what was going on, and you'll have documents like letters or financial records. It's the combined weight of everything that paints the full picture for the judge. All right, let's move on to a really critical distinction, something every law student has to master, the difference between a marriage that is void versus one that is voidable. They sound similar, but legally they are worlds apart. Here's the main takeaway. A void marriage was never real to begin with.
But a voidable marriage, that marriage is 100% valid until a court officially annuls it. It starts valid and needs a court to end it. This difference has massive implications, especially when it comes to the legal status of any children.
Now, the grounds for making a marriage voidable are a bit different. They mostly have to do with a defect in consent. For example, maybe one person was underage and didn't have parental consent, or maybe consent was given because of fraud or force. These issues don't make the marriage automatically void, but they give the wronged party an option to have it annulled. It makes the marriage valid but breakable.
So the judge's gavel falls, the marriage is declared void, the legal relationship is over. But what happens next? What about the life you built together, the house, the savings, and most importantly, the children?
For this, the landmark case of Dino versus Dino is our guide. The Dino's marriage was declared void because of psychological incapacity, but that was really just the start of their legal battle. The next big fight was over how to divide up everything they owned. This was the big question that kept people in legal limbo for years. Did you have to go through a long, messy property fight before you could get that final decree of nullity? The Supreme Court's answer in the Dino case was an absolute game changer. The Dino ruling created this brilliant distinction you see here. The court said, for voidable or bigamous marriages, yes, you have to sort out the property first because a valid property partnership did exist for a while. But for marriages declared void due to psychological incapacity, the court reasoned that since no valid marriage ever existed, no valid property partnership ever existed either. The assets are just co-owned. This means the final decree of nullity can be issued immediately. You don't have to wait, which allows people to finally move on with their lives. But what about the kids? This is where Article 54 is so powerful. This quote from the Supreme Court says it all. Legitimacy once granted cannot be revoked. The law basically built a firewall to protect children. Even if their parents' marriage is later found to have been void from the beginning, the child's status as legitimate is locked in. The legal collapse of the marriage can't reach back in time and harm the child. And really, this is the question at the heart of the entire family code. On one hand, the law wants to protect marriage as an institution, setting a high bar to get in and get out. But on the other hand, it has to provide real justice for people in unions that were fundamentally flawed. This constant tension, this balancing act between the ideal of marriage and the reality of human lives, is what makes family law so complex, so challenging, and so incredibly human.